After watching Lord of the Rings with my 8-year-old son, I decided to build him something from Middle-earth. Walnut cabinet, Doors of Durin, and of course, a secret compartment. So let's get started. So my son and I recently watched the entire Lord of the Rings trilogy together, and then the Hobbit trilogy, which means we spent roughly 19 hours watching people walk to a volcano. But he loved it. So I decided to build him a small Lord of the Rings inspired cabinet. I'm using walnut hardwood for this build, but there's a little sapwood mixed in there for some contrast. Or as we woodworkers like to call it, character. So the first step is milling all this rough lumber flat so that I can start building the panels. But before I get too far ahead of myself with the process, let's take a step back and check out the design. The front panel features the Doors of Durin carved with wood and filled with gold epoxy. The feet splay slightly outwards to help ground the piece and also pay a small homage to the hobbits. Inside, there will be 3 shelves for storage, and the bottom shelf hides a secret compartment with a push-to-open false back. Because if there's one thing that Middle-earth has taught us, it's that every good structure should probably contain a secret passage. Preferably not guarded by a giant squid. So, with the design sorted out, we can get back to milling the lumber. I start by flattening one edge over the joiner, this way everything's nice and square coming off the planer. Then I take the boards over to the table saw to cut them down to their final width. Before I start ripping them down though, I like to label each board with its final width. That way I can stack them from widest to narrowest as I work through them in order. It's a little more efficient this way because I only have to move the fence in one direction, which is narrower. Harry Styles. Yeah, anytime I can avoid adjusting the table saw more than I have to, it's a win. And since a lot of these pieces are going to become panels later on, I'm also keeping the boards in order so the grain flows nicely across the glue-ups. That's just one of those order of operations things that will help you out later on, mostly by preventing future me from messing stuff up. And I know this went in rather short order for you guys, but for me,
that's a lot of work.
With all the boards ripped to width, I can start building the panels for the cabinet. I lay everything out first so I can make sure the grain flows nicely across each panel. This is one of those small steps that makes the finished piece look a lot more intentional. Once I'm happy with the layout, it's time for glue. I spread a thin, even layer across one edge, then bring everything together in clamps. When it comes to panel glue-ups, the rule is simple. You can never have too many clamps. Mostly because if you own 10 clamps, you'll eventually convince yourself that you actually need 20. It's the woodworking version of second breakfast. Whenever I'm gluing up panels like this, I like to add a couple clamping cauls across the boards. These help keep the panels nice and flat while the glue dries. Because when you start tightening clamps, the boards have a tendency to shift or bow. And adding the cauls keeps everything aligned so you don't end up fighting the panel later on when it comes out of the clamps. Once the glue is cured, I like to use a scraper to remove any excess squeeze out. The sound is about as awful as a Nazgul screaming, but it gets the job done. From there, I'll hop to my random orbit sander to flatten out any remaining high spots. I'm not looking for a finished sand here, just something to smooth over any rough areas prior to cutting the joinery. With the panels all flattened out, I can start breaking them down into the parts for the cabinet. So I begin by cutting everything to rough width at the table saw. I like to leave these pieces about a 32nd of an inch oversized. That way I can come back with a hand plane and remove the saw marks and finesse the fit. It only takes a couple of passes, but it gives me a cleaner edge and a little bit more control over the final dimensions. Next, I swap out my ripping blade for a crosscut blade and set up my miter sled. At this stage, I'm only cutting the exterior pieces of the cabinet. These parts get cut to their final length because everything else in the build is going to reference off this carcass. So it's really important that these cuts are dead on. This is one of those steps where if you nail the final length, the rest of the build tends to fall right into place. But if you miss it, then suddenly every measurement from here on out has to change. And that turns a simple plan into a lot of extra math, and we don't like extra math. Now, while we don't enjoy extra math, hopefully you guys are enjoying this video. And if you are, make sure you hit the like button and subscribe. It really helps the channel out, and unlike woodworking math, it's quite easy to do. Next, I'll install my 3/4 inch dado stack into the table saw. I'm using it to cut 2 dados into each of the cabinet side panels, and these dados will hold the top and bottom interior shelves. To keep everything consistent, I use the fence to set the position of the cuts. That way, once the fence is dialed in, I can just repeat the same cut across both panels. It's quick, accurate, and keeps the shelves perfectly aligned inside the cabinet. Then I pop on my sacrificial fence so I can cut the rabbets along the back edge of the panels. These rabbets will hold the back panel later and help keep the cabinet square. It's really nice when all those line up like that. After cutting the dados at the table saw, I like to come back with a router plane to clean them up. This helps even out the bottom and make sure all the shelves sit perfectly flat. It's a small step, but a good fit here means the cabinet won't end up looking like something the orcs built. Next, I use a bar gauge to measure the exact distance between the side panels. That way I can transfer that measurement directly over to the saw. It saves me time from having to pull out a tape measure and guess, and anytime I can avoid guessing, that's usually a good thing. Especially when the goal is to build something from Middle-earth, not Mordor. So with my bar gauge in hand, I can butt it right up against the saw blade and then nudge over the stop on my fence. Once that measurement is set, I can pop in the panel and cut the shelves to their final width. Then it's time for the most important part, checking the fit. And this is one of those moments where you're hoping for a nice smooth assembly. Not too tight, not too loose, basically the woodworking version of Goldilocks. Or I suppose in this case, just right for the Shire. Once I have the shelves locked in their dados, I can once again use my bar gauge to take another measurement from the interior of the case. This third shelf will sit on shelf pins, so I want it to be a hair loose on the interior. From there I can cut it to width and check the fit, because unlike the One Ring, this shelf is actually supposed to come out. With the interior of the case complete, it's time to move on to the bottom panel. Unlike the top of the cabinet, the bottom is going to overhang by about 1/8 of an inch on all sides. That's because I'm planning to cut a bevel around the edge of the bottom so that it lands flush with the carcass but still reveals just a little along with the feet. To attach both the top and bottom panels, I'll be using Domino Joinery. So the first step is to lay out where those dominoes are going to go. Once I mark the 1/8 inch overhang on the bottom panel, I can temporarily position it onto the carcass. Then from there, I can transfer the layout marks for the joinery. With the layout finished, it's time to set up the domino. I'm using these settings to cut the mortises that will hold the joinery on the sides and the top of the cabinet. The nice thing about the domino is that once the fence height is set, the cuts are really quick and repeatable. So I can just work my way down the panels and knock out each mortise one at a time. And if you've never used a domino before, you can basically think of it as a biscuit joiner that went to engineering school. But for this cabinet, domino joinery really just makes sense. It gives you really strong floating tenons and also makes alignment during the glue up a lot easier. So instead of trying to keep everything perfectly lined up with clamps going everywhere, the dominoes lock the parts into position. And that's especially helpful on cabinet assemblies like this, where you've got a few different panels coming together at once. Next, I reset the fence height on the domino to account for the offset on the bottom panel. Since the bottom is going to have that 1/8 inch reveal, these mortises need to move slightly in to match. Once that adjustment is made, I can cut the mortises for the bottom panel as well. Same process, just slightly different position. So with all the joinery cut, it's time for a quick dry assembly. This is where I make sure everything lines up the way it's supposed to, because it's always better to discover problems before the glue shows up. And speaking of things showing up, let me show you a new addition to my laundry room. Alright, quick break from the build because I've got to show you something I've been using lately. This is laundry sauce. If you do woodworking, you know your clothes can end up smelling like sawdust, finish, glue, and sometimes all at once. My shop shirts take an absolute beating. These are their laundry pods. You literally toss one in the washer, and that's it. They've got a bioenzyme blend that helps break down stains. And the scent, well, that's the crazy part. It's actually designed by fragrance perfumers, so it smells a lot more like a cologne than a detergent. I usually throw in their scent boosters and conditioner too, and then a dryer sheet when everything goes into the dryer. And when the clothes come out, they're soft, clean, and they smell ridiculously good. My shop shirts honestly smell better than the shop now, and that's saying something. So thanks to Laundry Sauce for partnering with me on this one. If you want to try it for yourself, scan the QR code on your screen, or use the link and code in the description to grab some. Alright, let's carry on with the freshness and get back to the build. To create the hidden compartment, the back panel actually swings open on a pair of dowels. So the first step here is laying out the exact location for those pivot points. These dowels will sit in the bottom panel and the lower shelf and act as a simple hinge. Once the locations are marked, I take everything over to the drill press and drill the hole straight down. And hopefully this door will open a bit more gracefully than the doors of Moria. With the pivot holes drilled, I can cut the hidden door down to its final height at the table saw. But before installing the door, I need to remove a small wedge from the back edge. This edge is where the door pivots on the dowels, so if it stayed square, it would run into the side of the cabinet when it opens. Cutting the slight bevel allows the door clearance so it can swing freely. I did go ahead and tape the wedge back onto the door temporarily though. That way I can still reference the full length of the workpiece when it's time to cut the door to its final length. But I'm going to hold up on that for a moment, and first I need to drill the pivot holes in the top and bottom edges of the door. So I start by using an awl to mark the exact location for the drill bit. This just gives the bit a place to register so it doesn't wander when the hole starts. Then I can take the piece over to the drill press and plunge the holes in the top and bottom edges of the door. And with those drilled, the door should be able to rotate smoothly on the dowels once everything goes together. Next, I need to make some pivot pins for the hidden door. So I grabbed a couple of dowels I had laying around and ran them through the dowel cutting plate to bring them down to 1/4 inch in diameter. These are really just placeholders for now. I mainly want to test the motion of the door and make sure everything lines up. I'll make the final dowels later on once I know everything is working the way it should. With the dowels sized down, I can pop them in and check the motion of the door. This is the moment where you find out if your secret door actually works, or if you've accidentally invented a permanent wall. Luckily, the movement looks good. So with the door pivoting correctly, I can mark the bottom panel using the inside edge of the cabinet side. That gives me the final reference for trimming the door to its finished length. From there, I can head back over to the table saw and cut it down. And then pop it back onto the dowels to test the fit again, preferably before anything dramatic happens. And unlike the Balrog, this one shall pass. Once that looked good, I reassembled the entire case to check the door inside the cabinet. At this point, I was hoping that the wedge I cut out earlier would double as a false front to hide that gap, but once the door started to swing, it became pretty clear that that wasn't going to work. The wedge just ran straight into the door, so instead I ended up cutting a thin strip later on to clean up that reveal, which is a much more elegant solution and slightly less dwarven engineering. Next, I'm on to drilling the holes for the shelf pins using a simple jig so everything stays aligned between the two cabinet sides. And while I'm doing that, I've got a question for you guys. If you were living in Middle-earth, where would you choose to live? Personally, I've always been partial to the Shire, but Rivendell seems like a pretty nice spot too. So if you're a fellow Hobbit lover like me, start your comment with Shire. But if you'd rather live in the Elven realm, start your comment with Rivendell. And as always, if you start your comment with Shire or Rivendell, I'll reply to you first because I know you're paying attention. With all the parts cut, I can start sanding everything before assembly. This time I'm bringing all my work pieces up to 180 grit. At the same time, I went ahead and made the final pivot dowels out of walnut so they match the cabinet. After that, I take a hand plane to all the edges. This helps remove the saw marks and leaves the surfaces nice and smooth. It only takes a few passes, but it makes a big difference in the final fit and finish. And honestly, it's one of my favorite parts of the process. There's just something really satisfying about watching those thin shavings peel off. Plus, it's a lot quieter than most of the machines in the shop. With the parts prepped, I can move on to shaping the bottom panel. This piece is going to have a bevel all the way around the outside edge, so it sits flush with the cabinet but still leaves a little bit of a reveal. So I start by marking out the bevel line around the panel. Then I transfer that angle over to the table saw using a bevel gauge to set the blade. Once the angle is dialed in, I can start cutting the bevel. For this, I'm using a fence stop called a rip flip. The idea is that I can set my fence once for the final measurement, then flip the stop down to register the panel so I can make those second cuts. I cut the widest section of the panel first because once that cut happens, my layout lines disappear. But with the stop in place, I can slide the fence back to that exact position and finish the remaining cuts. It's simple, but it keeps the bevel consistent all the way around the panel, which is important because uneven bevels tend to stand out a little bit. With the bevel cut at the table saw, I can come back with a hand plane and clean up the edge. And this is one of those moments where the sound alone tells you everything is working. After that, I switched to a random orbit sander for the end grain to avoid any tear out. I'm going to use an angled sanding guide here so I can match the bevel and remove the saw marks without flattening the edge. This guide keeps the sander riding along the right bevel instead of rounding everything over. Once everything was prepped, it was finally time for the glue up. I started by gluing in dominoes to the top and bottom panels first. That way they stay put during the assembly and I'm not trying to juggle loose tenons while clamps are flying everywhere. It just makes the whole process a lot easier to manage. I did leave the bottom shelf out of the glue up though, and it's just sitting in place as reference for now. That way I don't have to worry about gluing in the pins for the hidden compartment while the entire case is coming together. I also like to run blue tape along the outside edges of a few joints before clamping. That way if there's any squeeze out, it lands on the blue tape instead of the side panels and saves a lot of cleanup later on. Next, it's time to carve the Doors of Durin into the front panel. Now, let me be honest with you guys. CNC carving isn't my favorite part of woodworking. Sure, it's impressive technology, but there's not a whole lot of hands-on skill involved once the file is set up. So the machine is going to do most of the work here. The actual carving took about 4.5 hours, but I've condensed that down to about 20 seconds for you guys. You're welcome. So I'll let the CNC do its thing, and hopefully it opens the door without needing a password. And with half a day gone just like that, I could finally pop the panel free from its pins and see how the carving turned out. And as much as I just said I'm not the biggest fan of CNC carving, even I have to admit, I'm pretty impressed with the results. With the carving finished, it was time to mix up some epoxy. I'm using West Systems epoxy here and using gold pigment to fill in all the carved details. The idea was to make these lines look like they were forged in gold, almost like something the Doors would have crafted deep inside Moria. I'll be honest though, I was a little nervous about this step. I've never actually filled a carving like this with epoxy before. And that might surprise some people, but like I said earlier, CNC carving just isn't really my thing. Once the epoxy was mixed, I used a plastic scraper across the panel to push it down into all the carved lines, making sure that every detail of the carving gets filled. Then I used a small torch to help release any air bubbles trapped inside the epoxy and gave the panel a few taps on the bench to see if any others would float to the surface. After that, there's not much left to do but let it cure overnight and hope that by morning I didn't just spend half the day forging gold for nothing. While the epoxy cured, I could move on to installing the hidden door. I started by dropping the bottom pivot pin in place, then sliding the false back panel onto the pin. After that, the lower shelf could slide back into position, and finally the top pivot pin went in with just a small dab of glue on the end. This way the door stays captured, but it can still swing freely. Since the feet on this cabinet are going to be pretty thick, I need to laminate up some material. So I started by trimming a thinner board down over at the bandsaw and then glued the two pieces together. My goal was to end up with stock about 2.5 inches thick, and since I had some downtime while the other parts were curing, this seemed like the perfect time to tackle that. So the next day I came back into the shop to see how the epoxy had hardened. Thankfully everything looked great. So from there I just needed to sand the surface back flush. I worked my way up to 180 grit and made sure to keep light pressure so I didn't accidentally erase any of the carved details. I did notice the epoxy settled slightly below the surface in a few spots, but honestly I think that helps the effect as it almost looks like the gold is flowing through the carving. I intentionally left the door panel oversized earlier so I could center the carving after the CNC work was finished. My CNC doesn't always hit the exact center of the workpiece, so this gives me a little wiggle room to adjust. To square things up, I use a track saw and reference off the bottom line of the carving. That way I know the design will end up perfectly centered once everything is trimmed down. Once I have one clean square edge, I can take the final measurement for the height of the panel. Then I head over to the table saw to trim it down using my miter sled. After that, I reference off my first cut and trim the panel down to its final width. Here I'm making sure that the carving stays centered on the door. The last step is to drop in a couple of 1/16 inch shims and test the fit. This ensures a good reveal at the top and bottom of my door. Happy with my top and bottom reveal, I went ahead and sanded my edges flush with the side panels. I left this panel just a 32nd of an inch wide on either side, that way I can sand the edges flush with the cabinet sides. Next, it was time to install the hinges for the cabinet door. Here I'm using European soft close hinges from Bloom. To drill the pockets, I'm using a jig that attaches directly to the panel and guides the drill bit to remove the material for the mortise. This makes installing one-off hinges super easy. I don't have to set up stops at the drill press or worry about lining everything up manually. Just clamp the jig in place and drill the pocket. Once the hinge cups are installed in the doors, I can move on to mounting the plates inside the cabinet. And with everything square, I can drive in the screws and lock everything in place. From there, I move on to locating the mounting plates inside the cabinet. To figure that out, I hold the door in position using my shims, and then I use a 2.5 inch block butted up against the top of the cabinet and the bottom of the cabinet as reference. I don't show this because it's a little bit tough to see, but I mark a line across the side panel and the back of the door at the same time. That way both pieces reference at the exact same location, and most importantly, I don't have to do any math. Because if there's one thing I try to avoid in the shop, it's woodworking math. I'm much more of a reference everything off something type of guy. It's faster, it's more accurate, and it keeps me away from my calculator. With the hinges installed, I can move on to the hidden door mechanism. For that, I installed a push-to-open door latch on the back of the cabinet. That way the door stays closed, but with a simple push, it'll pop open. Earlier, I had hoped that the wedge cut from the door would hide that pivot gap, but that didn't work out, so instead I cut this small strip to conceal that reveal. A little CA glue locks it in place, and now the door can swing freely with that gap staying hidden. With the cabinet mostly wrapped up, I could finally move on to the feet. Earlier I laminated a couple boards together so I'd have enough thickness to work with. So the first step here is milling that material flat and bringing it down to its final dimensions. From there I cut the stock into 2.5 by 2.5 inch blocks. These will become the 4 feet for the cabinet. Once those are cut, I can start laying out all the joinery. I'll mark the location for the mortises that will hold the rails connecting the feet, and then use my domino to plunge those mortises into the sides of each block. This will tie the base together and give the cabinet a solid foundation, which is important because this thing already weighs about as much as the chest of dwarven treasure. With the mortises cut out, it was time to lay out the profile for the feet. This is one of those steps that can get a little confusing as you're working your way around each of the blocks and how each face relates to the others. So before laying anything out, I like to orient the feet so the best grain is facing the front and the sides of the cabinet. Then I take the pieces over to the bandsaw and begin cutting in the rough shape. After removing one section, I'll reattach that offcut with a little painter's tape. That way I still have a flat reference surface against the bandsaw table for the next cut. This process can get a little tedious, especially when the angles start stacking up. So here I'm just taking my time and working my way around each foot. But since we have a moment, here's another bandsaw thought. Bananas are technically berries, but strawberries aren't. Which means fruit classification is somehow even more complicated than dovetails. And that's saying something. Once the pieces are all roughed out, I move over to a sanding jig that holds my random orbit sander at 90 degrees. This lets me clean up the bandsaw cuts and sneak up on my layout lines from earlier. I also like to keep those taped pieces attached while sanding. That way I still have a nice square reference edge to work from. From there, I just work back to the line, making sure that each of my profiles match on each corner. Slow and steady here, because once these feet are installed, they're going to be pretty noticeable. With the feet shaped, I could move on to preparing the rails that will connect the base. I started by running the stock through the planer to bring everything down to its final thickness. This also cleans up any saw marks and makes sure all the pieces are perfectly flat. From there, I could cut the rails down to their final length over the table saw using the miter sled. But before doing that, I temporarily attached the feet to the underside of the cabinet using some double-sided tape. That way I could take measurements directly off the actual case, which ensures the rails fit exactly as they're supposed to. And maybe more importantly, you guessed it, prevents me from having to do any unnecessary math. I think you guys are starting to get the trend here. Like a glove. With the rails cut the length, I could start cutting the mortises with the domino. Here I'm plunging all the mortises that will connect the rails to the feet. Once those are cut, all the joinery on the base is ready to go. From there, it's time to glue this base together. I taped on a few offcuts from the bandsaw work to help keep the outside faces of the feet square during the glue up. Then 4 F-style clamps provide pressure to pull everything together. I like to assemble small parts like this right on the bench top since it's about as flat a surface as I have in the shop, which is important because crooked furniture is rarely intentional. Once the glue had cured, I could flip the base upright and then hand plane those rails so they're flush with the top of the feet. Alright, now we're on to the finishing steps. First up is installing my brand medallion so that everyone knows who constructed this house. Once I've cut out the mortise, I can sand the exterior, add a little CA glue, and then tap the medallion home. Yeah, this is my precious. Next I need to route the rabbets for the back panel. I couldn't cut these earlier at the table saw because these are stopped rabbets and the other ones are through rabbets, meaning these rabbets would have been exposed by the sides had I cut them at the table saw. So now that everything's assembled, I can easily route them out using a rabbeting bit. This allows the back panel to nest nicely in the case. Once the majority of the rabbet is cut, I still need to square up the corners where they meet the sides of the rabbets. So I grab a chisel and mallet and clean those out by hand. From there, I can cut the back panel down to size. With that done, I can attach the base to the cabinet. I secure it from the inside rails using 4 screws. The holes were pre-drilled and countersunk so the screws sit well below the surface. Then I can go around the entire cabinet and break all the sharp edges using a sanding block. Here I'm just softening everything so there's no sharp corners where a human hand might land. Or an orc's. Who knows? From there we're on to the finish. First I wipe the entire cabinet down with mineral spirits and a tack cloth to remove any remaining dust. Then I mix up a 2-part finish of Rubio Monocoat and apply it liberally. And while I'm applying the finish, I just want to say thank you to everyone who watches these videos. I design, build, and film these videos on nights and weekends, so your support really means a lot. That said, if you'd like to support the channel a little further, I'd love to invite you to check out my Patreon. Members get discounts on plans and merchandise, access to the Discord community, and a few other behind-the-scene perks you just won't find on YouTube. So if that sounds interesting, you can check out the link down in the description. And if you've already joined, thank you for your continued support. Your donations go directly towards making these videos, so thank you. And to those of you who just watch, like, comment, and share the videos, thank you too. You guys are awesome. Alright, now that the finish is wrapped up, we can finally get on to what you've all been waiting for, the beauty shots. This cabinet ended up exactly as I hoped. Solid walnut, a little brutalist in its design, and the Doors of Durin carved right into the front. The gold fill almost looks like it was forged directly into the wood, and the hidden inside secret compartment, perfect for storing a few treasures. Or, knowing my son, probably his Lego. This project was especially fun for me because it all started after watching the Lord of the Rings trilogy with him for the first time. So now his tales of discovery can continue with his own little piece of Middle-earth sitting in his room. If you enjoyed this journey, make sure you subscribe. But if you're ready to go on another one, check out this video next. Thanks for watching, and as always, I knew this would work, and I'll see you next time.